Earlier in the year, we learned how to solve equations with inverses, and we learned that squaring is the opposite of square rooting, and so they kind of undo each other. So that's a technique that we're going to use in this lesson to get rid of the square exponent. We're going to square root to get the x by itself. The first thing that we're going to do is isolate the x squared term, or just x squared in general, on one side by doing inverses. So for example, here we would have to move the c over, and then we would divide by a. So you want to get the x squared totally by itself. So then what you're basically going to have is x squared equals some number we'll call d. Then you just simply take the square root of both sides to get the x alone. Now, here are some tips. You don't have to memorize these tips, but they're helpful because they'll save you some time. If the d value, remember x squared equals d, if the d value is positive or greater than 0, then there's going to be two solutions. Remember, in the last lesson, we looked at quadratics that had two solutions, one solution, or no solution. So if the d value is positive, it's going to have two x values. If the d value is 0, then there's only one solution. And if the d is negative or less than 0, then there's going to be no solutions. So remember, really what we're doing is we're just doing inverses. So let's pop up GEMDAS. And now we're going to squeeze a little r in there for the radicals, and we're going to call it GERMDAS. The way that we solve an equation is we do GERMDAS in the reverse order. And that's all stuff you already know. So if you look at example 1, the first thing that we're going to do is add 27, because we're going to get rid of the subtraction by doing addition. So you get 3x squared equals 27. Then I'm going to get rid of the 3 by dividing by 3. So you get x squared equals 9. Then when you take the square root of both sides, the square root of 9 is not just 3. Remember, it's also negative 3 because you can have a negative times a negative equaling a positive. So the way that we write it is we write positive and negative 3. So we put this symbol plus minus, that's our symbol that we're going to put right there. And the other way to write this is you would write x equals 3 or negative 3, but then you don't have to write it twice. So let's start writing it this way, plus or minus 3. All right, let's do the second one. First thing we're going to do is we're going to add 10. Now the x squared is already by itself, so when you take this square root, right, you only have one answer because 0 only has one square root, the number 0, because there's no such thing as negative 0. So that's going to be our answer, x equals 0. For the third one, let's subtract 11. We get negative 5x squared equals 5. Divide by negative 5. And you get x squared equals negative 1. So now I have a situation where if I were to go to take the square root, I can't, because there is no number when you multiply it by itself gives you negative 1. So the answer is going to be no solution. Now we know what these would look like in graphs. This would have two x-intercepts, this would have one x-intercept, and this would be floating up in the air and have no x-intercepts. But here's how you would see it if you want to use this technique. Now a note on this technique, it does not work when there is a b value. If you look up top, we had this equation right here, ax squared plus c equals 0. You notice that there was no bx in the middle. If there is a b value, you cannot use this method. You have to use something else. Now, you might look at example 2 and think that you have to FOIL this out, right? You might think that you have to do x minus 1 times x minus 1 and then all this other steps, but remember, you want to get the squared term alone. And if you look at this example, it already is alone. X minus 1 squared equals 25. both sides are perfect squares. So what we can do is we can just square root, and that makes the squared go away. So what we would have is we would have x minus 1 equals positive or negative 5. Now this doesn't work if there's a coefficient. You'd have to get rid of the coefficient first. But when the x squared term is by itself, which in this case it is, you can just square root. So now what I have is I have two equations. So really I have x minus 1 equals 5, but I also have x minus 1 equals negative 5. So I'm not quite done yet, unlike the other ones. So this one gives me x equals 6 because you add 1 to both sides. And this one gives me x equals negative 4 because you add 1 to both sides. And again, you can take these values, plug them in the original equation, and see if you get a true statement. As I read example 3, it gives me an equation and it tells me use square roots. The equation doesn't look super complicated, but it does tell me that I have to round my solution to the nearest hundredth. So I'm probably going to need my calculator. So pause the video and go get it if you don't have it right now. First step I'm going to do is to add 13. So I get 4x squared equals 28. Then I divide both sides by 4, because I remember my goal is to get the x squared term by itself. So now when you go to take the square root, you have the square root of 7, which is not a whole number. So you would get x equals positive or negative 2.65. When you look down at example 4, it might bring back some flashback, nightmare dreams that you had about that polynomial question. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't worry. If you do, then you know exactly which one I'm talking about. Anyway, let's just read it. A touch tank has a height of 3 feet. They have that marked in the picture. Its length is 3 times its width. So since that's not marked in the picture, I'm going to label it. So the length is 3 times the width. So let's say the width is x, and then the length would be 3x. The volume of the tank is 270. So what do I know? I know the formula for volume of a rectangular prism. That's length times width times height. And what they want me to do is they want me to find the length and the width. So let me plug in what I have. They tell me that the length, or well, I calculated that the length was 3x and the width was x, and they told me the height was 3. So let's just simplify that. We have v equals 9x squared. And actually, instead of v, what I'll put is I'll put 270. Oh, that's not really that complicated. Remember, you can't square root until you have the x squared by itself. So I'm going to divide both sides by 9, and I get x squared equals 30. So then x is equal to positive or negative. Let's say around 5.5, I think is the calculator decimal. Well, obviously that's even silly. It can't be negative because you can have a negative length. So it's just 5.5. So x is 5.5, which means that that's the width. And then the length is 3 times 5.5, which is around 16.4. So I'll say width equals 5.5, length equals 16.4, and the label is inches. Oh, okay, that wasn't too bad. Example 5, the area of an equilateral triangle with side length s is given by some crazy formula, and that actually is true. You're going to use this formula in geometry. They want us to solve the formula for s, so they want us to get the s by itself. Then, after that, we're going to approximate the side length if it has 30 square inches in its area. Okay, but first thing, let's just get the s by itself. So I'm going to write the formula. A equals the square root of 3 over 4s squared. So I'm going to do inverses. So the first thing I'm going to do is multiply both sides by 4. So I have 4a equals radical 3s squared. Then you divide both sides by radical 3. So we have s squared equals 4a over radical 3. Okay, now here's where the crazy part comes in. We have to square root both sides to get the s by itself. And you might say to me, Miss Lean, we already have a square root. And I'm going to say to you, but that's not related to the s. So we have to take the square root of both sides. So the value of s is 4a over radical 3 and the big square root of that. Now, you can simplify that. When you get to high school, you're going to learn how to simplify that, but this is what they want. That's the value of s. That's solved for s. Now, what we do is we're going to plug in 30 for a. So, that's an a, by the way. Right there. That's an a. So we're going to do the big square root, 4 times 390 over radical 3. And then you just simplify. So you get 4 times 390, which is 1,560 divided by radical 3. So you got to use your calculator for that. And you should get like 900 point something. So since it says to approximate, I'm just going to round that to be 900. And then you take the square root of 900, and obviously that can't be negative, so it's just positive 30 inches. All right, if you have any questions, write them down and ask me when you see me next.